Hello, and thank you for viewing Improving IEP Teams, Creating a Virtual Space of Change. This is a re-recording of a webinar presented by Peak Parent Center in May of 2021. My name is Ann Wilson, and I work on the Alternative Dispute Resolution Project at Peak Parent Center, which is a collaboration with the Colorado Department of Education. The purpose of the project is to improve communication and collaboration among IEP team members to resolve disagreements earlier in the process and prevent conflicts, and to result in better outcomes for students. We do acknowledge that conflict does arise and sometimes it can't be resolved informally, and there are dispute resolution options available when that happens. Peak Parent Center is a parent training and information center. We provide training such as this one. We are not a legal services agency, and we don't provide any legal advice or legal services or representation. To start, I just want to review the mission of CDE's Alternative Dispute Resolution Project. It is to provide a funded support system and toolbox of options for all special education stakeholders in order to increase a more collaborative IEP process and improve relationships. The Alternative Dispute Resolution Project is an optional process. There's no requirement for it under IDEA. So it takes various forms in different states. In Colorado, the Department of Education chose to make this idea of providing a support system and funded toolbox for all stakeholders. And so CDE works with Peak Parent Center so we can provide training such as this and have other resources available on our website. And CDE also provides a variety of trainings, and sometimes we train together. Before we get into the virtual space of change, I just want to kind of frame our thinking for this webinar's topic. Do you prefer drinking coffee alone or with a group? And maybe this is something you've thought of or not thought of. I know, like, when my first thought is, well, I like them both, but think about what's your stronger preference, because it's true, we both prefer one or the other in different contexts, but kind of thinking about what our default preference is. And the reason I asked this question is I came across a study that was done in China considering this question, and they actually found a correlation to where people descended from, whether it be from wheat farmers or rice farmers, and their preference for drinking coffee. And again, it's a small study and a correlation, but just sort of an interesting thing to think about. They found that there were more people who descended from wheat farmers, which is considered a more self-reliant individualistic activity, who preferred drinking coffee alone. And there were those who descended from rice farmers tended to prefer drinking coffee in groups, and rice farming is a more collective activity. So not expressing any opinion on the study or not, but it's just an interesting way to think about how we have tendencies and preferences that we don't necessarily know where they come from, and we may not even be aware of. And so that study related to individualism versus collectivism, and that's one way in which members of the team can really vary on what their stronger preference is. And so one of the ways in which we create a virtual space of change is the mindset we bring to the meeting. And so think about, how do we approach meetings? What mindset am I bringing to the meeting? Because a lot of times I think, for me, I'm just showing up because I've got a lot of things on my plate, and that's one more thing. And I kind of am thinking about, okay, what's going to happen, and things like that. So our key themes today are an overview of special education facilitation, including telefacilitation, talking a little bit about space of change, cultural sensitivity, and empathy. But first, I'm going to talk about facilitation. Since 2017, facilitation has been offered by CDE. It involves having an impartial facilitator available to come to IEP or other special education meetings. The facilitator is impartial, meaning that they don't represent either side and they don't represent any party at the table. They are also focused on process. They are not there to participate in the content of the IEP. They promote effective communication and participation by all. And they're available again for IEP and other special education meetings. It does not have to be a required meeting. It can be a meeting of the team for a specific issue. It's a voluntary process. It's also a free process, but it must be agreed to by both parties. And even if you're not using a facilitator, we're finding that facilitative skills can make IEP meetings more effective. And that includes using the skills that we talk about, but also there's some tools such as charting and preparing an agenda and things that help the meeting be more efficient as well. It's a relatively new process, and so not everyone's familiar with facilitation. And we like to clarify that it is not these other processes. Facilitation is not an advocate representing one side or the other. That might be a parent advocate. If you are a parent and want someone to work with you on your IEP and represent your interests, that would be an advocate. It could also be a lawyer. It's not a mediator, and it doesn't result in confidential mediated agreements. Both facilitators and mediators are neutral. It is not a formal legal process such as due process, and there's no third party saying that one side wins or loses. So really a benefit of facilitation is it keeps the decision in the party's hands. The objective is to achieve whatever the meeting's goal was, typically completing the IEP, but there could be another objective that needs to be carried out. And so as long as the team is continuing to work together, the facilitation keeps them working together and trying to achieve the outcome of the meeting. So when we talk about creating a space of change, we're thinking about the environment where the meeting takes place. And the facilitator, if they're facilitating a meeting, will look at the physical environment, how the meeting's set up. But really everyone contributes to the space of change by what mindset they bring to the meeting. And if we're coming in there sort of with a, I'm going to go in there to win versus I want to come in there to understand what the other side's perspectives are and work to develop the best plan for this student or for my child, we can often have better outcomes. When we think about space of change, some of the things that are involved could be balancing power among the parties at the table, preparing the environment, thinking about cultural sensitivity, and avoiding assumptions. When we talk about balance of power, there's a lot of factors that can contribute to different, a feeling of a power imbalance. Often the nature of the IEP meeting itself is difficult because there's the IEP team that works with the student and they're at the school and they have a lot of expertise. And then there's the parent. And so a lot of times the parent is unfamiliar with that kind of role of being an equal participant in a meeting with the IEP team. Some people are kind of, you send the school for the school to do education because that's what they do. And so this kind of brings people into an unusual situation. There are also aspects of, the IEP school team does this work all the time. And so they may use language or terminology or acronyms that are unfamiliar to the parents. So the facilitator will just kind of consider making sure the room is set up in a way and make sure that they're making sure everyone has a chance to speak, and the facilitator can support drawing out information from people or clarifying information if there seems to be some confusion. The environment is important. You want to have a physical space where everyone feels like they have an equal seat at the table and you're not creating some sort of imbalance like the school side on one side and then the family alone on the other side. We don't want to create the feeling of sides against each other. And so you want to create a space that is comfortable and emanates respect. And sometimes, depending on where IEP meetings are held, sometimes the space can be awkward. I know sometimes in the early years, there's sometimes there's a lot of small chairs and not many big chairs. So sometimes there's awkward things that need to be thought about. And sometimes there's just sort of the environment. Sometimes you hear stories of the IEP team that's kind of laughing and having a formal conversation, and the parent walks in and it goes silent, and that can be really uncomfortable and awkward. So thinking about how to begin the meeting and making sure that all participants are welcomed and feel like they have an equal spot at the table. The virtual environment adds added complications. And so always in the IEP process, it's important to build relationships before, during, and after the meeting, because it is an ongoing process. And, you know, we create the IEP as best we can, but sometimes things aren't working out. And we want to make sure we're communicating about that along the way and not just waiting until we have meetings. Also, for the virtual meetings, make sure that the families can get any technical support if they need that before the meeting. Make sure that families know what to expect for the meeting. And if you're a family and you're having a virtual meeting and you have questions, be sure to ask. There's such a huge range of how people spend their time in virtual meetings versus not. And so communicating about that is helpful. Provide interpreters and accommodations as needed. The virtual environment creates a different sort of auditory visual experience. And so there may be things that a family needs to participate in that environment that they might not in person. Also, we find that there are issues arise. There can be system issues, there can be signal issues, and it can just take longer to communicate with people muting and unmuting and things. It's helpful, and a facilitator would establish meeting norms at the beginning. But if there isn't a facilitator, it's helpful to establish meeting norms and what's different. Something that is helpful to talk about is how to ask questions. And if you have a question about how to ask questions, be sure and ask at the beginning. And again, the facilitator will always try and refocus the team to keep them forward facing, meaning working forward and trying to develop a good plan as necessary. An important aspect of a space of change is creating a feeling of psychological safety in the meeting. And then psychological safety, this is a quote from Amy Edmondson, is this belief that one won't be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes. I know from talking to parents that it can feel uncomfortable in that situation, because you know these are the people who are evaluating your child and spending their time with them, and so you don't necessarily feel comfortable speaking up all the time, and so it's something to be aware of in the meeting, to make sure that people have an opportunity to share and that we're open to those opinions. Something that I've experienced as a parent is there seems to be a lot of variation too in how parents interact with the school. And so I sometimes hear people talk about there's some squeaky wheel parents, and sometimes as parents we're uncomfortable. We don't want to be that, you know, sometimes we talk about that parent. We don't want to become that parent. And so we're trying to balance how best to interact. Cultural sensitivity is important for IEP meetings. Research shows that culturally and linguistically diverse families have lower levels of participation in the IEP process. This is due to a number of things, including language and cultural differences, lack of understanding, perhaps on the side of the professionals, and lack of support from the systems. And as much as we try to provide interpreters and documents in translation and things, it's still hard to get the support needed. When we're talking about culture, we're thinking about knowledge and beliefs, ideals and preferences, and most of us probably have a variety of cultures, and we're kind of shifting from, the culture of our family, the culture of our workplace, the culture of the school, the culture of our community. And so we're kind of shifting among different cultures all the time. And different cultures may have different views about education, and that may come across in the interactions in the IEP meeting. Each school also has its unique culture. Here we talk about the cultural elements in a school district, including customs, artifacts, meaning physical things such as books, materials. Sometimes there's a lot of banners in schools highlighting values that they want to emphasize, behaviors, values, and beliefs. And there can be a lot of variation among schools within a district. And there can also be different values. I know there's a lot of different types of schools now. So there may be a range in how they respond to different behaviors and what they emphasize and things. So try and learn what you can about the culture of the school. And it's something to kind of observe and as you learn more about the school. This is just a diagram of the stages to becoming culturally responsive for all of us. And I don't know if this is really a stepping stone. It's like, because in different situations and as things evolve, we may be at different stages at different times. We may go, kind of ebb and flow in different areas. But think about being aware, being curious, learning, and being engaged. Avoid assumptions. Sometimes we have a tendency to dismiss the content of what someone's saying because we don't like the way they said it, or we have a negative feeling about the way they're delivering it, or something that maybe a prior interaction has caused us to view it in a certain way. So we want to again try and avoid bringing in those preconceptions to the meeting and think there may be more to learn. There may be something we don't know. And when we are interacting in the meeting, be mindful of language, tone of voice, facial expressions, and cultural barriers. And in one of our other trainings, we talk about how much of communication is nonverbal. It's really a small amount that's actually the words that we say. And that's lost to some degree in the virtual setting, but you can still pick up on tone. And you can pick up a little bit about you can still pick up on some body language, so be mindful of that in how you're communicating. Sometimes people's words don't match their body language, and so you can convey a feeling that you may not be aware of. This is another quote to that idea that we may not be aware of a lot of things until we're in a situation where it's entirely different. And so this is a quote from a David Foster Wallace commencement address. And I believe it also came from an earlier book that he wrote, but it's just this idea of two fish swimming in the water. An older fish comes by and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And then the boys continue on, and then they're wondering what is water. So they spend all their time in water, but they aren't aware that they live in water. And we want to keep that in mind and think about, how does our frame of reference affect our assumptions? What's sort of our default way of thinking? And how is that relative to other members of on the IEP team? Because in different situations, we may have a different sort of perspective, and we may be in some situations, you may be more formal than others. In other situations, you may be the least formal one. And so just thinking about that can be helpful to approaching the meeting with a more open mindset. And when we think about cultural sensitivity, it's not either or, it's both and. And kind of this is a quote from a book called The Culture Map, which is really interesting. It looks at cultures around the world on, I believe it's 8 different dimensions. And it's really interesting to look at how different cultures approach different things, such as like the relationship with time and And some cultures want to spend a lot more time. And I think in American culture, we tend to want to be more efficient. And so even issues like that can really change how people perceive things. But you don't want to, so this quote says, yes, every individual is different. And yes, when you work with people from other cultures, you shouldn't make assumptions about individual traits based on where a person comes from. And that's absolutely true. But this doesn't mean that it's not important to learn about cultural context and being aware of ways to support better communication. Along the lines of keeping an open mind, think like a scientist. And this is a quote from a recent book by Adam Grant, that thinking like a scientist involves more than just reacting with an open mind. It means being actively open-minded. It requires searching for reasons why we might be wrong, not for reasons why we must be right, and revising our views based on what we learn. It's easy to kind of come in and with an idea and look for things that validate that idea. They talk about confirmation bias, where we're trying to confirm what we already see. And so it's that really actively trying to see reasons why we might be wrong. What am I missing? Cultural reciprocity is again this idea of becoming aware of what are deep-seated values and in our beliefs and practices, and how we can explain those, and through that process how we might see how they might not they might be embedded in some of the beliefs that we have, and that people might not share those same values. And in particular, there's different views about education and what the purpose of education is for, things like that. So the more we can have awareness and try and reach true understanding of what each party brings, it can help achieve better outcomes. Empathy. Empathy also contributes to mindset. This is a Webster definition, that the action of understanding, being aware of, being sensitive to, and vicariously experiencing the feelings, thoughts, and experiences of another. But just if we come in with an attitude of empathy versus kind of confrontation, we can reach better results. Sometimes the IEP meeting feels like it's two sides, but it isn't really intended to be that, even though it often feels that way. And so if we come in, it's like we're against each other versus, this is a collaborative process, and we are trying to do the best we can in this system to reach the best outcomes for the students, and that we all have that interest of the student in mind. It can kind of help us remember where we're connected. If we don't act with empathy, we may have less critical thinking. One of our other webinars is on sources of resistance and how things like cognitive load, scarcity, lack of information, and emotion can sort of increase resistance. And sort of without empathy, we may have more resistance. Empathy helps us to make sure we're considering all the perspectives and not creating additional barriers. And we can also result in anger or harm to the relationships, which then we have to spend a lot of time sort of repairing those relationships. So key points: listen first, then listen more. One of the things we talk about a lot in the trainings is one of Stephen Covey's habits of highly effective people. And that's, you seek first to understand, then to be understood. And focus on listening rather than responding. And one of the trainings talks a lot about active listening. We often kind of listen to the beginning and think we know what the rest is going to be and start formulating our response. But often we're wrong when we do that. So really focus on listening first. You can even pause or clarify before you respond. And we want to respond rather than react. One of our other things we talk about, kind of pause, practice that, just pausing before you say what you feel like you need to say right away. Again, take the approach that you could be wrong. And when you're presenting an idea, be open to the possibility that other people might have different ideas. So rather than saying, this is absolutely the case, you might say, perhaps this, or I think this. And we think empathy is critical because it helps us to treat others in a more respectful manner. I am having technical issues and not able to play this video right now, but I just want to recommend this video on empathy versus sympathy by Brene Brown. I think sometimes it's nice to have this reminder, and this is like a short 3-minute video that looks at the two things. You can find it on YouTube. One of the points she makes is that an empathetic response rarely begins with "at least." And I catch myself saying "at least," or, someone will say something and I'll want to say, well, at least this didn't happen. And so I like this video as a reminder for me to try and to focus on empathy versus sympathy. There are a lot of ways to engage with the ADR project. There are trainings such as this one, and we have additional training. Sometimes we have longer trainings, but there's a lot of ways to get more information on the project. A lot of districts have engaged with the ADR project and have built capacity related to facilitation. You can check with the special education director of your district if how they handle facilitation. And there are the impartial statewide facilitators through CDE. If you are interested in requesting a special education facilitator, if you maybe if you have if your team's having trouble working through issues and you think facilitation might help, again, we want to be preventive, so we're not saying that there's a conflict, but there may be a conflict that you want to try facilitation with, but it could be pre-conflict as well. If you want to talk about that more, you could contact Mary Ann Fleury at the Department of Education, and her contact information will be coming up. But to request, you go to the CDE's ADR web page, and there's a red button where you request an IEP facilitator, and you'll have the form to fill out. Either side, the parents or the district or school, can fill out the request, but both parties do need to agree. So if you're thinking about requesting one, it's nice to let the team know that you want to try this process, because the process is based on the idea that the team is still talking and working together. And so you don't want to just request it and have them receive the request from the facilitator without knowing it's coming necessarily. And then once a facilitator is assigned, the facilitator will develop a mutually agreed upon agenda. And that can be really helpful to know what everyone really wants to talk about at the meeting, what their concerns are, because sometimes there can be a lack of communication where one side thinks the issue is one thing and the other side thinks it's different, because we just all have a lot going on, and sometimes this is hard to communicate, and a lot of times there's miscommunications. Some additional resources: the CDE website has a lot of information on facilitation. Our website at Peak Parent Center also has some recorded webinars on other topics related to alternative dispute resolution and facilitation. And the Center for Appropriate Dispute Resolution in Special Education is another great resource. We highlighted a few resources here. I believe their website is cadreworks.org. Again, it's the Center for Appropriate Dispute Resolution in Special Education. The statewide facilitators also offer office hours. I believe it's every Tuesday from 4 to 6 p.m., but that time may have changed. You can get the most current information from the CDE website. And if you do want to find out more of whether facilitation might be an option for your IEP team, please contact Mary Ann Fleury, the Alternative Dispute Resolution Specialist at CDE. Here's her contact information. Also be aware that at Peak Parent Center, we have parent advisors who are available to provide one-to-one assistance. During the school year, they're usually available Monday through Friday, 8:30 to 3. I'm not sure if the hours are adjusted in the summer. And they can also be contacted by email at parentadvisor@peakparent.org. It's PARENTADVISOR @peakparent.org. And that ends the presentation for today. I hope you learned more about the ADR project and facilitation, and how to think about the mindset that you're bringing to the meeting to create a better opportunity for having a productive meeting and creating the best plan of supports you can. Thank you.